Alrighty then, so tier lists are getting popular again, and in Final Fantasy XIV I'm seeing them pop up everywhere. I even did a video reviewing one of the tier lists that I saw. So I get asked all the time what I think of this raid tier, what I think of this job, da-da-da-da-da. So I figured, why don't I just do some tier lists? Sure, why not, right? In this video, I'm going to be sharing my tier list for all of Shadowbringers Savage raids. Now, these things aren't based on any one particular thing, the mechanics, the punishment, the difficulty. It's really a feeling kind of thing. So it's just my opinion. And honestly, after you watch this video, share your opinion in the comment section of the video below, because I'm sure we're going to disagree on a bunch of things. And with that, let's get to it. Alright, so I figure it's best to probably do these chronologically, so I'll start with the first Savage encounter in the whole expansion, and I'll end with the last one. I'm not going to be including Ultimate in this video. I have my own idea for a potential Ultimate tier list that I could do in a separate video, but we're just going to be looking at the Eden's Savage encounters for this one. Alright, so let's start with E1S, the first encounter in Eden's Gate on Savage. Honestly, this was a pretty comfortable intro for new raiders as the first Savage fight of the expansion. While it does have just some basic placed AoEs, point blank AoEs, donut AoEs, you know, that kind of stuff, it also does a lot to stand out as its own fight thematically. There's AoEs that deal damage based on max HP. It teaches you mechanics in one phase and then reverses how they work in the second phase without even really giving you too much of a heads up, so it has that kind of cryptic prog nature that's still kind of intuitive, if that makes sense. It does have some phases that have really tight movement and placement for mechanics, and a double hit tank swap, which is a nice basic way to teach that for people just getting into the raid scene. It actually has a lot of mechanics that we've seen before, but done in a quick and effective manner. It does have some weaker points though, especially the ad phase, which not only has two of the simplest Savage ads in the entire game, but a minute-long mid-battle cutscene. Sure, it's nice to get your cooldowns back, but this is a trend they overuse in this expansion, and I don't look forward to it on repeat clears ever. For this first encounter, I'm gonna give it an A. It's a really good first fight for the tier, and honestly a really good first fight for the expansion, both in mechanics and what the boss actually is. Its new player design might leave it a bit underwhelming for vets like myself, and the long cutscene is a drag after a few times, but I do really like this fight. Next, we have the second fight in Eden's Gate on the Savage difficulty, the Voidwalker. For me, this is like a secret goat of a fight on this list. The fight has a ton of great and original concepts that work well in the Savage scene. Spell in Waiting, which forces you to remember AoEs for the future, is a personal favorite, and it makes a cool resurgence later in the expansion in a more souped-up format. It also has what are called cycles, which just chains boss attacks together in rapid fire, and it's based on attacks that you've been seeing the entire fight. It makes the fight knowledge from earlier sections way more valuable, and it adds a heart-racing finish, especially for newer raiders, and it's just super rare to see a quality like this in a second fight in a raid tier. It also has a mix of mechanic failure punishments that I think are healthier for the scene. Deaths are obvious, but damage downs, petrifies, healing reductions, it reminds us that instantly wiping the raid isn't the only way to punish new raiders for mistakes, or raiders in general, and it allows for a healthier learning curve in my opinion. And for that, this actually gets an S tier. I look back at this fight with fond memories and went every week going, man, imagine if this was harder. When your only complaint is you wish the fight was later in the tier so it could flex a little bit more difficulty, I feel like that means you loved what you played and you just wanted more. And in a way, we definitely got that, but we'll talk about that later. Then we move on to the third fight of Eden's Gate Savage, Leviathan. For me, kind of a personal low point in an otherwise fantastic raid tier. I think the overall fight design is okay. The mechanics all flow well, there's a good wave of different things to learn at a reasonable pace, and a surge of visual effects to add gravitas to the fight. It's very atmospheric. However, it just feels like, I don't know, they could have done so much more, especially considering it's the third fight in a raid tier, even if it is the first raid tier in an expansion. It felt like they just wanted to do a bunch of water-based attacks, and they didn't really account for how thematic or interesting they would be to do, except for a couple. I'm also personally never a fan of the giant boss that sits still at the north side of the arena style fights. They often just force you to use the far end of the room in really uninteresting ways, or at least try to until you get enough gear to ignore it. Now, despite my harsh criticisms, I'm gonna give this a B. I think my personal bias against this fight just kind of brings it down to B tier, but not any lower. It's genuinely hard for me to fault the mechanics themselves. This fight just kind of leaves me feeling underwhelmed. Others who like it more, I totally get it. Good thing this tier list is just my opinion, right? Oh, then we move on to the final fight in Eden's Gate Savage, Titan. Oh man, Titan Savage is an absolute blast of an encounter. In fact, this fight makes me feel the way I felt about the previous encounter because of just how much better executed this one is. Definitely benefiting from being that final fight, but it's just on a whole nother level. It has tons of thematic attacks, both to the original Titan and ones that are newly thematic to this one. Fast-paced execution, and it really just asks the best of your entire team. The first phase is one of the best Savage phases of all time in my opinion, and is a big reason why I love it so much. The second phase goes to being that, boss in one place thing I don't really like, but this is probably the only fight where I feel like it's done well. The entire arena is part of the boss's arsenal, and not just because there's a proximity AoE that needs to get put in the back of the room. It asks that everyone heavily consider where their allies are when doing mechanics, so much so that you're almost glad the boss is in one place. The arena manipulation and destruction just adds so much personality to the fight. And the final phase is an ultimate level mechanics barrage. Simple movement, tight healing and mitigation, and it's just trying to prey on your fatigue, which really gets the heart racing again. While it does kind of feel like the end is a little bit underwhelming in retrospect, you are just on your toes the entire time, and I love this fight for it. And for that, I actually had to add a rank to the tier list just to give this one its own place. Rank is S+. It's just on another tier from the other S rank encounters. Seriously, I love this fight so much that if there was a single fight I'd recommend you do in the entirety of Shadowbringers with Echo disabled and minimum item level, it would be this one. It will make a raider out of you yet. Alright, we gotta slow things down a bit because we're going to the start of the next raid tier, which means a dramatic drop in difficulty, so we can't grade this one entirely the same. Moving into the Eden's Verse raid tier, we start with Ramu Savage, and it's another good first encounter in this raid tier. This is my favorite first fight of all of Shadowbringers Savage raiding, even if only by a little bit. It has a wide variety of mechanics with some execution-heavy sections, lots of arena awareness, and of course, orbs. I do think it has some weaknesses. The tank mechanics are pretty meh at best, and it makes for some uncomfortable methods of optimizing while also trying to survive. It also has a bit more open-ended sections in its execution due to slight changes in fight-to-fight boss rotation, something that I love to see, but it does mean headaches for players who learn it differently or just don't pick up on certain things at all, because it's going to be a grief to everyone around you. And any lapse of judgment or attention just quickly gets you or your allies killed. So despite this one being my favorite of the first encounters, it's going to share a tier with the other first encounter in that of rank A. Honestly, I kind of wanted to give it an S because I gave E1 Savage an A, but it still has enough flaws to keep it a little bit down on the list, even if it is my favorite first fight. The awkward tank mechanics and an underwhelming portion or two only makes me favor this one slightly more over E1S, so I'm going to keep it here in the overall ranking. Then we move on to the second fight in Eden's Verse Savage, which is Ifrit and Garuda, which will also become Raktapaksa in the later phase. And honestly, this is probably my least favorite section to talk about in the entirety of the raid scene for this expansion. This fight has an interesting premise. Two bosses that you fight at one time, then you fight them at the same time, then they merge together to create a new boss. Very anime. I feel like I've seen that in like a dozen animes or so. However, all the mechanics, even the unique ones, just feel, I don't know, empty? It feels like the fight is over so fast, and sometimes that means you're having a good time and you just lost track of time. But here it just feels like you just did the same 3 or 4 things the entire time over and over and over again with slight changes as you went. And even the few unique mechanics just aren't all that great in my opinion. It's just, I don't know, it's a shame for me personally. For that, I gotta give this fight a C. I mean, a C is still average, right? There's certainly worse fights and fights I like less, you'll find that out soon. But when a fight feels like it's over so quick but you didn't really achieve anything, it just leaves a lot to be desired. This is a ranking based almost entirely on feel, and not how the mechanics actually interact with the players, and I know that's going to get a bit of grief from people, but I just got to go with my gut on this one. And just when you thought the negativity train would have left the station, it was actually just showing up at the next stop, because then we move on to the third fight in Eden's Verse, the Idol of Darkness. I don't even know if that's what it's called. I didn't even look before recording this, because I don't even want to talk about this fight. I said there are fights I like less. This is those fights. Easily the worst fight in all of Shadowbringers, in my opinion, for a number of reasons. First, boss staying in one place. It's even worse because it's just a bunch of birds around an idol, so it's not even like it's like a super interesting boss visually. It uses portals to fire AoEs through, and this could have been so cool. But the portals are so slow and predictable that it's almost like it isn't even there, especially later in the fight after the first week of clears. You get color debuffs to determine attacks you need to get hit by, which is the bare minimum thought process they could add for sections like this. It basically just eliminates a bunch of places you can't stand and tells you, well, obviously, I gotta stand in this one remaining spot right here. And every attack that's in between these thematic portal mechanics are just about standing in one place and being teleported to another place. The ad phase is mildly interesting, definitely better than E1S, and actually my favorite part of the fight, but considering how few ad phases there even are in all of the Eden fights, that's not a very high bar to set. And even the final phase, just not interesting. And this boss is standing still now in the middle of the room instead of at the north. I don't know. I don't like this fight. That's where it is for me. And for that, this gets a rank D, right at the bottom of the list. It suffers from similar problems to E3S, but it's not just about potential being wasted. It just has more boring mechanics, less interesting prospects, and in my opinion, it's just, if I could set it lower, I would. It's just, for me, the worst fight in the entire expansion. Okay. Now we can leave the negativity train station and go into positivity, because next we have E8 Savage, that is Shiva Savage. Oh boy. This encounter is going to be very divisive when people watch this list. While some definitely hate it because of its light rampant mechanic early in the fight, I actually really like this fight. It has a ton of really fun and interesting mechanics, yes, even light rampant. It also has the best ad phase of the entire expansion, asking you to balance positioning, healing, priority, and even crowd control, something people forget even exists in this game. Unraveling all the different puzzles with the mirrors and the half-room AoEs, when to move, where to move. This fight just does things like that almost as well as E4S. What it doesn't do as well is perhaps the healing checks outside of ad phase, and it does have a problem with failure clarity. Like when things go wrong and people die, it's not uncommon for everyone to just go, what happened? Which is not really a great thing when you're trying to improve on an encounter. It also has that long mid-fight cutscene I don't like as much. E4 Savage did have a mid-fight break, but you could actually act during the animation for it, so you could prepare for the coming phase. Not here, and it does get tiring after a while. So despite having a few more criticisms of it than E4S, it's going to also get stuck in S+. It's only a bit below E4S, but it feels wrong saying it's the same tier as the other stuff I have in S itself. It has a couple of issues, but when it shines, it really shines, especially that ad phase. Yeah, you get a useless damage buff if you do it perfectly, but I'm just hard-pressed to dislike this fight. It boils down to, I don't hate light rampant, I guess. Alright, let's wind down again because we're going back into a first encounter in that of Eden's Promise. The first encounter in that raid tier on Savage is the Cloud of Darkness, and again, it's a really good first fight. I don't know what it is, but they just really nailed first fights in this expansion. Solid mechanic variety, consistent positioning checks, and it's just really well balanced despite that. The only problem with the fight is the 7 people you'll be PvPing against when you do it. Well, honestly, whether you're in a pickup group or if you're with your static. In Bramble phase, mistakes often cascade into defeats, regardless of the strat. Psst, do box strat instead. In the tile phase, hesitancy or lack of awareness does the same, and some tight late fight movements, that was tough to say, can quickly punish players who are just pixels out of position. I love the intensity of it all though, even if I'm looking over my shoulder to see who is about to ruin my day. Honestly, this fight, it gets an S tier, which is not something I often give to first fights because they are often deliberately lower on these lists just because they're not as intense or they're not as interesting, but they made that really tough for me this expansion, and this definitely deserves an S tier for me. It's hilarious watching people fumble around this fight, but it doesn't take away from how well designed it actually is when it's done right. This raid tier, specifically Eden's Promise I should say, also has bigger hitboxes for better strategizing around melees and very few breaks in the fight, and being this is the first fight in the tier, it really benefits from that initial impression. After that, we move into the second encounter in this raid tier, the Shadowkeeper. It's another solid fight, to be honest. It's very gimmicky with all its mechanics. It has multi-hit tank busters and follow-up attacks, lots of AoE placement, and tight position checks. I feel like it's kind of a love it or hate it type encounter, and even if you do like it like I do, you can recognize some pretty awkward design choices. The orb mechanic has this weird time for locking in its target that leaves people feeling like, hey, I did it right, but then you just get killed a second later. There's also a lot of visual clutter from the shadows, and having healed this fight, I can say that when people do the gimmicky things right, it's really boring to heal. I'm sure there's other things I've missed healing-wise in this, but my first-hand experience with this gives me a little bit more insight into it. But you know what? I will say this. When you do the mechanics wrong, oh boy. This fight's gonna get a B rank from me. It sits on the same tier as Leviathan. I don't think it's that bad, but its fight flaws are quite noticeable, and it can be just as frustrating as it can be smooth in two completely identical pulls. Definitely a tough placement for me, but I feel comfortable enough with that. Now on to the third fight in the Eden's Promise Savage Raid tier, and that of the Fatebreaker. I've thought long and hard about this one. This fight utilizes a lot of concepts present in Voidwalker all the way back in E2S, which I said would be cool if they did that in a fight that was like later in the tier or a harder fight. I thought this fight might be that. I don't think it is. It just doesn't do enough. The fire, lightning, and light variations on attacks and the different card and circle AoEs, the dragon stuff during the downtime, honestly, none of them are that interesting. They feel like minor additions, and they instead just overplay the same types of attacks way too frequently. At the end, when the cycle-style mechanics return from Voidwalker, it is a tight execution and healing check, but compared to the rest of the fight, it just doesn't stack up. Voidwalker has a way better mix of unique and interesting mechanics in my opinion, despite how long ago it was in relation to this one, even if there is a lore-accurate reason for all the ways that the mechanics play out in this fight. For that, we're gonna continue the trend of third encounters. Man, I said that they got all the first fights right and it was great. They just got all the third fights not great. This one's gonna get a C. This is one of those fights where when I'm playing it and I'm not thinking about it, I kind of just glide through it. And when I think about it more, it's just so basic for its place in the raid scene for the entire expansion that I can't put it higher on the list. I just don't know what was wrong this expansion with the third fights, but hopefully next expansion it'll be better. And with that, we move on into the final instance for Shadowbringers Savage raiding, and that of E12S. Eden's Promise Eternity is split into two encounters. There's a checkpoint in the middle, and they're both roughly 8.5 to 9 minutes each. So I'm actually going to grade them separately for the sake of this tier list. The first phase against Eden's Promise, aptly named, is a pretty good first phase. The primal memory mechanics, the heal and mitigation checks, the references to the older fights in the raid tier, one of my favorite things because it makes it actually feel like a real journey getting up to this point. And if you don't have Echo on, the DPS check is really tight. Overall, it's just super thrilling, even if it is shorter than the other final fights because it's split into two. I don't think it is the flair of E4S or E8S, but it is just such a well-rounded first phase for this final encounter, and it's really hard to fault it in any way. Everyone's moving, everyone's participating, and everyone's hopefully not panicking. So where does it land on the list? I'm gonna put it in S rank. I'm hard-pressed to put it in S+, so it's just gotta go in the rank below it. It doesn't really have any flaws, in my opinion, but it just doesn't have that oomph to it that it really needs, and I think a lot of that is because it is such a short encounter. The encounter lengths on Titan and Shiva really serve to raise the bar that extra bit, that anxiety, that excitement. It really gets captured in those 12, 13, 14-minute encounters that it's just missing here from this final first phase. Perhaps if there was no checkpoint for the second phase here, I think I'd stick it in S+ in that case. So then what about the second phase against the Oracle of Darkness? This fight suffers from some similar problems to the first phase, but on a little bit of a steeper slope. It has some great plays on the spell and waiting mechanic back from Voidwalker, some pretty tight movement and position checks, and a real gut check with the healing in the end. However, again, it's a pretty short fight, and it has very sporadic difficulty. Honestly, I find the first couple of mechanics to be tougher than the majority of the later ones, and it makes for a kind of underwhelming finish even through all that healing. It's aesthetically brilliant, it's nostalgic for the music and boss references, it gives off a really good atmosphere for the mechanics. It just falls a bit shy of some of the other fights in the expansion. So with that, as much as I really want to stick it in the same tier as the first phase, it's going in A rank. It's the only final fight that didn't at least make it to S tier. Obviously A tier means I really do enjoy it, but just misses a few too many marks due to the nature of E12S being a 2-fight raid and its sporadic difficulty. And with that, these are all of my rankings for the Eden Savage raid for Shadowbringers. I have talked about these fights so much in the past, but it was nice to finally compile all of them and come up with a final ranking for them. But this isn't the end. Let me know what you think about my rankings in the comment section of the video below. Let me know what your rankings are, because perhaps if you're a tank or a healer, you have way more experience on those roles, or maybe you just judge these things on different parameters. You might have vastly different opinions, and you know what? Believe it or not, you can do that on the internet. I believe in you. Anyway, with that, I'll see you in my next tier list, because on top of some other videos, I definitely got one of those coming. And if you want to ask me questions about stuff like this live, don't forget I stream on Twitch every day, 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. Even though I'm not playing 14, come in and ask questions about it. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, take care.